Hello and welcome to my presentation on a project which aims to answer the question, what happens to multiplicative thinking skills when students are grouped and engage in targeted zone-appropriate tasks. My name is Reid Barry and I'm a teacher at New Norfolk High School and I teach maths and science to year 7s. So this presentation on multiplicative thinking in the middle years will be presented in 6 stages. Firstly, an intro and context, then moving on to the rationale and literature for the project, then into the nuts and bolts, the method and the methodology that this project has undertaken. It will then go into the data collection process and also the findings, then an analysis and discussion of those findings, and then it will conclude with some future focuses. So, as a little bit of context, New Norfolk High School is placed right about here, just up the river from Hobart, and if we zoom in, there it is there. And it's a relatively disadvantaged school. It has an ICSEA value of 881. And if we have a little snapshot at this My Schools data here, actually only 5% of students are above or in that top half, and 95% of students are actually in the bottom half of the ICSEA Australian average value. So if we have a look at some data from the year 7s in their SNMY zones, or their scaffolding numeracy in the middle years, actually, this is a beautiful graph that shows this beautiful trend down, and they mostly group in the zone 1, 2, and 3. But if you look at the Australian curriculum, especially the year 7 maths curriculum, they're actually supposed to be up here. This is the expected year 7 zone, in zone 5, 6, and 7, and only 5 students are actually in that zone. So if you think about it, these students here are unable to actually access the year 7 curriculum because they haven't got the prerequisite skills. So that leads me on to this quote from Professor Diane Seaman, or Di Seaman. She's a emeritus professor at RMIT, and she says that no child should leave primary school without confidence and strategies for all their number facts. No excuses. But the way we're doing it at the moment is actually not helping a whole lot of kids do that. They're not getting past that critical grade 3, 4 hurdle. And you can certainly see that in our data here. So the rationale of this project is to provide targeted teaching of multiplicative thinking according to student progression along a learning and assessment framework, or a learning progression. So that's your classical zone of proximal development, starting with a concept that students are able to access and then challenging them to move up that progression with activities that really engage them. So there is quite a bit of literature in the realm of multiplicative thinking, but I'm just going to keep it brief with these 3. There's heaps of references there, but we will step through what multiplicative thinking is. We'll be using some of the scaffolding numeracy in the middle years resources in our assessments, and also we'll be looking at the learning progressions within the big ideas in number. So what is multiplicative thinking? And Professor Seaman has actually said, in short, multiplicative thinking is indicated by a capacity to work flexibly with the concepts, strategies, and representations of multiplication and division as they occur in a wide range of contexts. So that's moving from this groups of, or count-in models which are additive in nature, to these more arrays or grids which are multiplicative in nature. We're trying to get students to see numbers as these arrays or grids, which will really help them moving forward and really assessing the achievement standard, which is right here. And you might be asking, well, where does a student need multiplicative thinking to achieve success? And if you look at this, there's no mention of multiplication or division. There's a bit of, some of them mention operations, but why do they need multiplicative thinking? Well, if you delve into the nuts and bolts, the gears behind each of these descriptors, multiplicative thinking actually comes into account in all of these. So over half of them require multiplicative thinking. So if you think back to that graph I showed you at the very start of our student cohort, half of them can't even access the year 7 curriculum. So that's where the big ideas in number comes in. So this is a 6-stage progression. And multiplicative thinking comes in just before halfway, and it's actually a year 4 skill. So we're trying to build our students up to this multiplicative thinking standard. Each of these skills builds in each other, so students will first need trusting the count before they master place value, and once they master these two, they can start working on their multiplicative thinking and beyond. So the method and methodology of this research is an action research pedagogical inquiry, which takes a mixed method approach. So we're going to be using quantitative and qualitative data with more of an emphasis on that quantitative data, especially in pre and post tests, but we will be using a little bit of teacher observations and also student surveys, and we're going to be quite pragmatic with its interpretation. So we're going to look through the lens of the interpretivist paradigm when we look at all of this data. So what's the method of our project? So if we look at our Year 7 cohort, which is 80 students, we actually followed an initial assessment based on the scaffolding you'll see in the middle years material, and we placed all of our 80 students into zones according to where they sat on the learning and assessment framework. And we call these number focus groups. And we actually dedicated one of our 4 maths lessons per week to a dedicated number focus group. So we split students up into either zone 1, zone 2, or unfortunately we ran out of teachers, we put zone 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in with the same teacher. So that's quite a lot of students. So how did we narrow down the study? Well, today in this presentation, I'm just going to be focusing on this zone 1. So the focus of the project is just on those 21 students in zone 1. So with regard to zone 1, if we look back at our big ideas and number, this learning progression, zone 1 students are actually still working on this trusting the count. This big idea of being able to look at a group of objects and be able to see these numbers in terms of their parts and as they relate to the number or the numbers of those parts. So a quick little note here is that we will only be focusing on zone 1 students, so not the whole cohort, but just zone 1 with regards to their trusting the count progression on that big ideas learning progression. And while I call this multiplicative thinking, these students are actually pre-multiplicative thinking. So I'll just call it multiplicative thinking for consistency, but sometimes I will refer to trusting the count. A little bit on ethics, student data here has been de-identified. All of the senior staff have been identified about this project, and also we'll only use this for assessment purposes and to ensure we have some quality teaching practices observed. And looking at our data, whenever I think about data collection in terms of teaching, I think of what can the students do before the intervention. You do the intervention, and then what can they do after the intervention? And we've done this in 2 steps, well, 2 types of assessments. One is a quantitative assessment, which is a pre and a post test from an assessment from SNMY, which is called Butterfly House, and another one which is also a quantitative assessment, which is purely based on recognizing or testing each zone's capacity to do the big idea in that zone. So for zone 1s, that is just trusting the count. So for our Butterfly House assessment, these are our findings. And as you can see, here's our pre-test in blue and our post-test data here in orange. I'm going to let the data speak for itself here, so I'm just going to let you look for a little bit. And I want to move on to the other data, and we'll analyze this just in a moment. So our next data is our zone-appropriate assessments, and these were essentially supertizing slides. Students were explicitly taught how to supertize. So supertizing is essentially looking at a group of objects and being able to say that's 5, instead of individually having to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Students were also covered some splats, which are their ability to both supertize and also subtract or understand that 4 can be made up of 2 visible dots and also 2 dots underneath this splat. So when we look at our trusting the count findings, this is what we find. And again, I'll let the data just speak for itself here. We'll get into a proper analysis in a moment. So let's analyze this data. Let's just really focus on what our students have actually done. Let's look at it through our lens. And let's start with Butterfly House. Well, obviously this is great. None of the students, unfortunately, here were able to achieve a 6 out of 6, but this student here, student 4, has gotten quite close. But if you actually add in an extra little column here, which details progress between their pre and their post, this is what you get. And looking at this graph, you can see that 4 students have improved, 4 students have declined in their progress, and 5 students have actually got no progress at all. They've gotten the same grade as in their post-assessment as their pre. So you can actually say overall, with regards to Zone 1 student multiplicative thinking, this intervention has not worked. With regards to their second assessment, which is the trusting the count, you can have a look at the findings, and we can actually see that students generally did better at the supertizing slides than the splat. So the splat they found a little bit more difficult. Maybe that's to do with part, whole reasoning, and maybe we need to really strengthen that in some of the Zone 1 students. All of the students passed both assessments. They all achieved either 50% or above. Only this student number 12 only just got there with 50%, but all of them did quite well. And if you think about it, why don't we put a mastery level on these assessments? So if we implement a mastery threshold of, say, 85% to move students onto their next zone, so to make sure that we're keeping students within their ZPD and they're not getting too comfortable with these activities, that would look like this. 7 out of the 13 students have actually improved their trusting the count skills to move up to Zone 2. So that means that student 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10, they've actually kind of graduated into the Zone 2 category, which is really, really exciting news. So overall, the targeted zone appropriate activities have assisted over half of the students in Zone 1 classes. There is a bit more analysis on the strengths and improvements, but I'll outline these in my final report. So in conclusion, what happens to multiplicative thinking skills of students when students are grouped and engage in targeted zone appropriate tasks? Well, Zone 1 student multiplicative thinking is not affected by targeted zone appropriate activities. And that kind of makes sense. They're not up to multiplicative thinking yet, and we've only really been targeting their trusting the count skill. So if we change this question now to what actually happens to Zone 1 students trusting the count skills when students are engaged in targeted zone appropriate activities, and we have a success. Zone 1 student trusting the count skills generally improve. So there are a couple of future focuses, and we're actually going to continue this into Term 4 and hopefully into next year, contingent on staffing and timetabling. But hopefully we can continue this to really see some good results, because like most pedagogical inquiries, they require more than a term and a bit to actually have a full effect. There are a heap of references just on here, and I'd like to thank you for listening to my project and my inquiry. If you have any questions, I'm really passionate about this topic of multiplicative thinking and also about this project, so send me an email and I will endeavour to answer your questions as best I can. But thank you very, very much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.